Uh, Good afternoon and welcome to the next session of selective readings in British and American poetry. And this session is very important because we are moving from British poetry to American poetry now. So as you remember last time when we were discussing Auden, I mentioned that Auden is a good point of transition because at some point of time he has been a British as well as American poet. Robert Frost also is, in that sense, a transition, but I thought Auden was also, in terms of themes, he also represents a transition from old English, the conventional English themes of countryside and so on, to more modern themes. Now, Walt Whitman is an American poet, right? He is an American poet. He has there are no two ways about it. He is a quintessentially an American poet. And we are going to study, or we are going to analyze one of his poems. And later on, for your next assignment, you're going to analyze another poem of his. So pay attention and let's move on to something. Let's talk about Walt Whitman as a poet before we move on to the poem itself. So Walt Whitman, popularly known as America's poet, right? He's known as America's poet. So his work is synonymous with American. He's one of the most influential poet of American canon. He was a poet, essayist, journalist, and one of the most influential writers in American literature. A second of 8 children. He worked as a printer's apprentice. He worked as a Civil War nurse, which I've not mentioned there, but he was a Civil War nurse, a school teacher, journalist, and finally he found fame and a kind of a renown in society as a poet and a writer. And he's self-taught. He did not undergo formal schooling much, but the influences range vastly from Greek poets like Homer to Romans like Dante, Shakespeare, who's a very English, philosophers like Thomas Carlyle, and then American writers, one of the most influential being Emerson. But he was also friends with other famous writers like Louisa M. Alcott. You must have heard Little Women, the writer of Little Women. So he knew Louisa M. Alcott, Poe, Edgar Allan Poe. So they were all writing at the same time, and they were, in a way, their work influenced each other. So Emerson is one of the greatest influences on Walt Whitman, and he's linked to a movement called American Transcendentalism. Now, what is American Transcendentalism? Now, Whitman was greatly influenced by Emerson, as I said, and he said, look at Emerson. I'm quoting Whitman. He says, look at Emerson. He was not only possibly the greatest of our land, our time, but with greatness of any land, any time, any world. So he counted Emerson to be one of the greatest poets of any land, any time, any world. And he had read Emerson in his school, in his formative years, and attended lots of lectures given by Emerson, where he also met other famous writers like Alcott and Thoreau. Now, what is American Transcendentalism? Transcendentalism is a belief in essential unity of all creation, right? That all creation there is a kind of unity, there is a unified spirit that goes around in each of the creation. And there is an innate goodness. It believes in innate goodness of man. Man is a part of nature, and since nature, they share the same spirit, they share the same unity. There is an innate goodness in man, and the supremacy of insight over logic, right? Spirituality, insight, intuition, a supremacy of these qualities over logic, and experience of revelation of the deepest truths, right? You don't have to really follow logic. You need to feel, you need to be one with the universe to experience the revelation. So it is eclectic. It was very cosmopolitan in its sources. It derived partly from the Romantic movement in England, the writers like Wordsworth, Coleridge. So it shared some characteristics like, this belief in nature and oneness with nature. But in America, it originated in 1830, and between 1830 to 1855, it kind of represented American Transcendentalism, was a field of battle between older generation and the younger generation, and the emergence of a new national culture, which is based on native, native natural material, native and natural world of America. Right? So it is kind of celebrating Americanness through the native natural world of American landscape. Uh, Very interesting, his first published work, the famous one, was Leaves of Grass, published in 1855, and he kept on working, and so the work kept on evolving till the end of his life, but it was very influential. It is counted one of the greatest works in American poetry, Leaves of Grass, published in 1855. Now, Leaves of Grass, when it was published, it shocked many people. It really did shock many people, and not everyone liked or appreciated Leaves of Grass. For one, it was not a conventional kind of poetry. Whitman was writing a different kind of poetry. It lacked proper rhyme, rhythm. It was non-traditional in its style and content. It was not really writing about traditional things like English poets who were quite influential in America. And the most problematic part of Leaves of Grass was unabashedly sexual and sensual, often homoerotic imagery. Look at the word, look at this line, I sing of body electric, right? So it was quite explicit in that sense for those times, and so it was criticized for being foul, it was criticized for being slanderous, morally unprincipled kind of work. But one of the poems I think that a lot of you might be familiar with would be "Oh Captain, My Captain." I'm sure some of you watched the Robin Williams film, Dead Poets Society, where this poem is kind of features in the movie. And it was written on Abraham Lincoln's death. Whitman saw Abraham Lincoln as one of the greatest leaders of the country, and Lincoln's death plunged Whitman into a numbing grief, and it's the elegy that Whitman wrote for Lincoln, "Oh Captain, My Captain," is perhaps one of his most well-known work. Right? And it is again very unconventional in form, and it's quite popular, but it is not like regular poetry. You must all go. I'm sure you want to read some of his poetry. Read "I Sing Body Electric." Read "Oh Captain, My Captain" to have some idea of how Whitman scandalized the generation of the time. So some of the features of Whitman's poetry, he captures rhythms of natural speech. He's not writing poetry. He's not up there something with special language, special features. His poetry is about rhythms of natural life. It's written in free verse, right? Free form. You remember the introduction? It is not structured like a sonnet with a rhyme pattern and a rhythm. It is free verse. It's a flow of everyday speech. Vocabulary is drawn from everyday language. It's based on real world, not an artificial world, not a beloved put on a pedestal and worshipped. It's very grounded. It's very sensual. It's very earthly. And another famous poem, and this is my favorite one, and he says, I celebrate. This is a poem it's called "Song of Myself." And it begins with, "I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you." Right? So this is a section from "Song of Myself." Later on in the same poem he says, "All this I swallow and it tastes good. I like it well and it becomes mine. I'm the man, I suffered, I was there. I'm the hounded slave. I wince at the bite of dogs." He tells of the massacre of Goliath and of other battles. So you see, he is writing in a very everyday language. He's drawing He's drawing stories, he's drawing references from Bible, he's drawing references from earlier English poetry, he's drawing references from Bible, he's drawing references to, he refers to slavery. So he's drawing references from American history, right? So in a way, he's a very people's poet. Well, another famous, whoever degrades another degrades me, and whatever is done or said returns at last to me. So he's a poet of the people in that sense. Now, some of the themes of Whitman's poetry, as I mentioned, he's talking about now. He's talking about kind of, there's a freedom in his poetry. He's America's poet. He's writing about this new, it's a new poem for a new nation. So as I mentioned earlier on, that this poetry is about freedom, it is about solidarity, it's about a new nation that is coming into being. And it focuses on this transcendental power of love, brotherhood, friendship, comradeship, imaginative projection into others' lives. And what does that mean? Look at the lines that I read earlier. What I assume, you shall assume. Every autumn belonging to me as good belongs to you. So, in a way, how do we imagine oneness, unity of being, unity of creation by imaginatively projecting into others' lives? There is optimism about democracy, there is optimism about equality, a belief in regenerative and illustrative powers of nature and its value as a teacher. So nature as a teacher and nature as a guide to lead mankind, and equivalence of body and soul. And that is, body is very important, and that is where Whitman scandalizes many. Whitman is different from many other poets where he gives an equal importance to body, mind and soul, an unabashed exaltation of body and sexuality. So now let's go on and read the poem that we have written for our module that we have to do, and it is called A Noiseless Patient Spider. So a noiseless patient spider I marked where on a promontory it stood, isolated, marked how to explore the vast surrounding. It launched forth filament, filament, filament out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly seeding them. So the speaker notices a silent spider, a noiseless, patient spider on a little ledge where it stands isolated as it observes the vacant, vast surrounding. Right? In a way, notice the alliteration here to emphasize the vacant, the emptiness, and the vastness of the landscape. It launched forth filament, 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 right? It's launching itself, it's launching filament, filament, filament. It's kind of exploring this vacant, vacant vast surrounding. Sorry. So speaker further notices that I launched forth filament, filament. So it's kind of spider letting out, sending out a thread after thread after thread, the spider's web, you know, that thread. So sending out a thread after thread to investigate, to explore this vacant vastness. So reaching out from itself, from its tiny self to explore the vacant vastness. So there is a contrast between the size, the tiny size of the spider and the vacant vastness of the landscape, and how this tiny little insect reaches out to explore the vacant vastness. The spider is described as doing this constantly and perpetually. So the repetition, filament, 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 launched forth. Again, the alliteration and repetition here. So the spider doing it something constantly, perpetually, without getting tired, without slowing down. So that is what that's the image of the spider, ever unreeling, ever tirelessly speeding them. So sending out thread after thread. And then the poet turns to the speaker's soul. But you, O my soul, where you stand, surrounded, detached in measureless oceans of space, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them, till the bridge you will need be formed, till the ductile anchor hold, till the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere, O my soul. This second stanza addresses the speaker's soul, which also, like the spider, stands isolated, unconnected in this vast open space, surrounded, detached. But unlike the spider who's launching forth filaments, who's launching forth threads to explore, to connect to the surroundings, here the soul is detached in measureless oceans of space. So, but at the same time, like the spider, it is ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them. So it is like the spider is continuously considering, exploring, seeking connections. The speaker says that the soul will go on to do this till it succeeds in finding and creating links between itself and the surrounding, till the bridge you will need be formed, till the ductile anchor hold, till the soul uh, grounds itself in this landscape, till the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere. Now gossamer thread, like the spider's web, it links the spider's web to this tentative exploration of the soul, right? So like the spider's thread, this gossamer thread of the soul's exploration would catch somewhere and link itself, anchor itself to the surroundings. What are the themes? Mainly isolation and connection. The spider, it explores the relationship between the individual self and the larger world. The poem depicts a spider that is isolated in space, but actively seeking filaments, sending itself out, seeking to build connections. And therefore the spider becomes a kind of extended metaphor for human soul, which is also isolated and working continuously to find a sense of connection with the world around. Ultimately, there is a suggestion that in spite of loneliness, people will experience that we all experience being individuals, a sense of disconnection that we all experience since we are individuals. The soul, if the soul seeks out, if as an individual you seek out, you will find an anchor. Your gossamer thread will fling that you fling out would catch somewhere, right? So it is and the contrast that is set up between this soul and again an individual, a single soul, a tiny insect, and the vacant vastness surrounding the measureless oceans of space, as if you're there. It's not just the landscape of the universe. It is like a soul in a universe, again, unanchored, floating, isolated till it finds some kind of a ductile anchor, till the gossamer thread catches somewhere. And there is a kind of patience, a noiseless, patient spider. There is a tirelessness, there is a patience, there is as one explores the surrounding and creates this web of connections that we are meant to do. And of course, a sense of activity, doing it, although there is a tirelessness, there is passion, but there is also a sense of a constant activity, launching forth filament out of itself. Again, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres and to connect them. So despite the patience, there is a ceaseless sense of activity to build connections, right? So in a way, it implies that there is something there is some kind of meaning. Once you have an anchor, when the gossamer thread you fling catches somewhere, there would be some kind of a meaning, some kind of meaningful connections can be made with the world around, with the universe around. So as I said, spider becomes a metaphor for human soul, which is detached and yet ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect. In a way, some critics have also thought that just like a spider creates a web, probably it is a soul of the soul that it could be a human soul. It could also be a soul of an artist that is struggling, ceaselessly venturing, throwing, seeking, creating to form new bridges, to create artwork, to have creative endeavors that would make connections with the others around him. So in the last two lines, if you see, the poem switches into future tense, right? It is future that it is anticipating, where finally this effort of musing, venturing, throwing, and seeking the spheres would bear fruit, and there would be connections formed between the soul and the landscape, the soul and the. So in that sense, the poem is also about creativity and creative expression, right? So in the future, the artist's work will find a resonance. So if there is a kind of, he's giving hope to the artist, he's talking about how the artist's work would eventually find resonance with the world around him. Now coming to the form of the poem, as you can see, there is really no set pattern. As I said, he's a master of free verse. He's the one who he writes in free verse, and that was one of the charges against his poetry, and yet he keeps on writing in free verse. As you can see, each stanza is one line, right? Each stanza ends with a full stop, so it's one line. There is a repetition. He uses repetition. He uses alliteration. He uses this repetition of participle verbs to kind of create a sense of continuity, to create a sense of ceaselessly working. And so the metaphor, he creates a metaphor here in the first paragraph, in the first sentence rather, and then he links it to the human soul in the next sentence or the next paragraph. The lines, as you can see, are all uneven. There is really no rhyme or rhythm or kind of pattern to the soul except the metaphorical comparison between two things. So in a way we can say that the poem itself is sending out filament out of itself, musing, venturing, exploring, seeking. It does not look at form, it does not look at rhythm. It is just exploring the world around to kind of create connections. So in a way, in that sense, the form of this irregular form, the form of free verse, expresses the exploratory nature or the exploration, this kind of reaching out that the poet is talking about in the poem. So so the poem in itself is an extended metaphor for human soul and its search for the space in universe, its place and connections with others around in the universe. And in a way, it is also metaphorical. So the spider is metaphorical for human soul and also the artist and the creativity of the artist, seeking, creating, venturing into the new worlds to create connections. And the poem ends with this very hopeful last two lines where he says that this will happen, right? Whitman is extremely optimistic, extremely hopeful in most of his poetry. So this will happen, these connections will happen, and then our life in the universe would have some kind of a meaning. So thank you and see you next time.